Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Everett, and welcome to our webinar, Podcasting Past, Present, Future, with Stephanie Kuo, Vice President of Content at PRX. The Southern Documentary Fund is a nonprofit that cultivates documentary media made in or about the American South. We believe that media has the power to change lives, and we provide makers with resources to champion Southern storytelling, serving as a leading advocate, providing filmmakers and artists with professional support, filmmaking grants, and fiscal sponsorship. Today's webinar is a special one, and Stephanie will give an overview of the stakes, trends, and players in the world of podcasting, as well as what it takes to produce a desirable, feasible, and viable podcast in 2024 and beyond. We will definitely be having questions throughout the presentation today. We have a Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom platform. Put all your questions in there, and we definitely will get to those today. And we'll also have some space at the end of the presentation to answer your questions as well. I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to Stephanie. It's your turn to go.
Thank you, Chris. Right, my screen is going. Yeah, so today we're talking about podcasting, past, present, and future. I give this lecture pretty much multiple times a year, and I update it every year. And so, fortunately for you all, the most recent time I did this was in Atlanta back in July. So not much has changed, which is good because we don't want the industry to move too quickly. Um, so just a quick introduction. I am Stephanie Kuo. I'm the Vice President of Content at PRX. PRX, for those of you who are unaware, is a nonprofit public radio and podcasting company, an audio storytelling organization based out of Boston and Minneapolis. I myself am in Brooklyn because we are largely a remote and distributed company as well. PRX was founded in 2003 primarily as a public radio disruptor, in that back in the day, um, there was only one or two ways that you could get any of your content as an independent producer on the radio, and that was either you worked for the public radio station or you were going to burn a CD or send a hard drive by mail, and you hope to hear from a program director several weeks later if it would work on the radio. We really disrupted the system of public media in 2003 by developing technology to make audio distributable digitally, which is kind of essentially what a podcast is. It's audio that's distributed digitally across the internet. And so PRX very much is a part of podcasting's past, present, and its future. And I think that's always just a fun little tidbit to share, in that if you were to imagine public media, if any of you are big public radio listeners, as this big fortress that was really impenetrable for many, many years, PRX's role in the early 2000s was to poke holes in the stones and figure out how to get independent producers visibility. And that is a mission that we hang on to even till today, not only on the radio space, but in podcasting as well. Our mission has always been to serve creators and to support the independent podcasting ecosystem as best as we can. As you can imagine, if at all tuned into the news of podcasting, or you've heard about the big deals that Spotify has given to Joe Rogan Experience, as well as Call Her Daddy, shows like that, you know that that level of independent spirit of being able to make a podcast in your garage with your friends has been slowly diminishing over time. And so PRX's calling and our mission has been to figure out ways to continue to poke holes in the fortress of big ecosystems and industries. So that's why I'm here. Training and education initiatives is one pillar of that. And so prior to being the vice president of content, I was the director of training at PRX for 5 years, and my job was to design accelerator and incubator programs for independent journalists and creators, put on conferences, free webinars, free workshops. We just wrapped up two free 3-day podcast conferences in DC and Atlanta. I saw some of you might be from the Atlanta area, so maybe you were there. If not, we hope to be back in the area again in 2025. All right. So before we get going, I wanted to share just a slide of resources that I think would be really helpful if you're trying to understand the industry of podcasting. What's an important thing to know about the industry now is that it's not it's not an industry of artists anymore or an industry of craftsmen anymore. You really have to be, in order to be a podcaster, you have to be able to make the work, but also understand the landscape that it fits into, and to really have a keen awareness of how to develop your show, not just as a work of art or as a passion project, but as a business too. And so all of these newsletters and these resources are a great way to really build up that body of knowledge. I subscribe to almost all of these things and I read them fairly regularly. Pod News and Inside Podcasting are two newsletters that are in my inbox every day. And I don't read everything in them, but I do make sure to read the top items because they usually talk about acquisitions, changes to podcast revenue, as well as new shows on the market, big awards, big players to think about. Sounds Profitable is a great newsletter that I also get in my inbox every day that focuses specifically on the business of podcasting. So it'll get in the weeds about revenue, cost of ads, and all those things. But it will honestly make you a much more fluid podcaster if you're able to understand how much ads are worth for your show, how you're going to negotiate ad revenue for your show one day. Um, and then the other one that I really follow pretty frequently is the Infinite Dial, which is a report that is put out by Edison Research and Triton Digital every year. It is a report about consumer habits across digital properties, so audio, social, websites. It provides PRX and a lot of other organizations a baseline understanding of who's out there, who's listening, and where are they coming from. So that report comes out every year. It's a fun read. They also have a free webinar associated with it as well. Okay, so let's get into kind of, I think, actually my favorite part of this podcasting lecture, which is the historical overview. And as Chris said, there will be multiple opportunities to chime in with questions throughout this webinar, and I'll do my best to keep up with the Q&A, but there will also just be dedicated time at the end of this as well. And also there will be opportunities to participate, so please put your thoughts and ideas in the chat. That would be really helpful for me. So the historical overview, the past of podcasting. I like to think of podcasting in terms of big waves of movement. Um, all right. So the first wave is really kind of in the early 2000s, around 2003. Even though PRX was digitizing audio, we had not coined the term podcasting, and we certainly weren't owning that we invented podcasting. But the term podcast was first coined. There is an article out there that's attributed to a single person who came up with the word, but I take that kind of stuff with a grain of salt. But anyways, what I'll say is the term podcasts were first seen in the public psyche in 2004. And that's because we were understanding and we were discovering that you could distribute audio through an RSS feed. An RSS feed, if you're unaware, is basically a link, a piece of code essentially, that updates regularly and pushes updates to people who subscribe to that RSS feed. This is technology that was built around blogs, and they realized you could attach audio to it, and that's how podcasts could be distributed as well. The second wave, which is not long after the early aughts, the launch of the iTunes directory, which became fully supportive of podcasts. We were listening to music in iTunes for much of the early 2000s. And then somewhere around the mid aughts, they realized that they could really begin distributing podcasts on iTunes as well. One of the first podcasts I ever listened to was an iTunes exclusive, which was the Grey's Anatomy recap podcast with Shonda Rhimes and Betsy Beers. And it was something that I listened to every day. So I was listening to podcasts before I even knew what they were. I would also love to know in the chat what your first podcast was, the one that you first started listening to. And then the release of the iPhone happened in the early 2000s as well. And what that meant was that people could start doing things on the road. They weren't attached or tethered to a computer anymore. They weren't tethered to an Ethernet cable. They could take their media with them. And that's really important because audio and podcasts are so built around being portable. All right, the third wave. This is when we really start seeing a precipitous change in podcast consumption. So one of the most important things that happened was that Apple Podcast app was not only developed, but it was released as part of the iPhone iOS system. So that meant that you no longer had to download the app separately. So if you were to start up a new iPhone, the app would automatically and organically be built into the operating system. And that really eliminated barriers to for people who weren't sure how to access podcasts. They were already there. Spotify was also beginning to adopt podcasts. I am a Spotify user, and I remember very clearly what it was like to try to find podcasts on Spotify. Discoverability was really rough. There was not really a clear way of like how to toggle between looking for music and looking for podcasts, but clearly Spotify was trying to enter the game as well during this time. Smartphone and mobile listening was growing across the US and also worldwide. At this point, almost a majority of American phone users were on a smartphone. And this is a bit of trivia, but let's say this is around 2014, 2015. What podcast launched around that time that really changed how people consumed and viewed podcasting? Zach says Serial. Sean agrees. Yep, you're right. This is a lecture that I used to also give way back in 2000 and 2018. And this was people were less aware of Serial being the answer to this question. So it's great. Anyone here listen to Serial? Fans of Serial? I admittedly only listened to the first season and half of the second and realized that they weren't going to ever recreate the magic of the first season. So yeah, so Serial launched, the launch of Serial really signaled for PRX as, and for me as researchers, as industry followers, a moment where we saw podcasting plateau and then spike, essentially. We saw Google search terms for podcast spike after Serial came out. We saw listenership go up after Serial came out. We also really, what Serial also did was open up different formats of podcasting. Prior to this, what people thought of podcasts to be were two people talking, really unedited, raw, conversations that were happening. The cliche of two bros in their garage with microphones was very much the dominant perception of the field until Serial came out and helped not only restructure how we could engage with audio content, but also really spiked public radio's skin in the game as well. Serial was a public media property from This American Life, and public radio stations said we could do this too. So public radio stations really started jumping into the game in this after Serial came out. All right. The fourth wave is actually, I think, the moment that became it, the fourth wave signals a moment of great growth for podcasting, but also what I would say is also kind of a huge economic bubble for podcasting as well. So the fourth wave, this is what we're talking the years of 2019, 2018 to 2022. We're seeing corporate acquisition and consolidation of wealth. So the serials of the world, the big boom in podcasts kind of really got big companies very interested in podcasting as a revenue stream for them. So we started to see big acquisitions, Spotify buying Gimlet, for example, and Anchor, Spotify paying $250 million for Joe Rogan Experience and those types of things. So this is the start of all of those big corporate mergers and acquisitions of big properties. That also meant that all of the wealth was kind of being consolidated at the top and at the big and for the biggest players. Catalog booms, so portfolios and podcast catalogs of these companies were growing exponentially, and there was a race to get to get bigger portfolios, bigger shows, and to have more and more and more properties in their portfolios. It was a numbers game at this point. Growth in ad technology. So ad revenue was becoming more and more accessible and easier to implement because there was technology that could automatically insert advertising into entire catalogs of work at the click of a button. Before this, people were having to record ads and bake them into the production, and ad technology said we don't have to do that anymore. And this opened up over $1 billion worth of ad revenue over the course of a few years. This is where also the early globalization of podcasting is happening. I'm really proud to say that PRX was at the forefront of this effort. We partnered with Google Podcasts in 2018 to really bring podcasting and to make podcasting more accessible across the world, but also to really support podcasting at an industry in multiple bright spots across the country, across the world. And so we were working with creators out of Kenya, out of Brazil, Taiwan, across Europe, and we were really seeing podcasting grow as an industry outside of the United States, Canada, the UK, and Australia, which was very exciting. All of this, though, everything above the corporate acquisition, consolidation of wealth, these big catalogs getting bigger, more and more and more and more money and more volume, really put a pressure on that open and once independent ecosystem. So if you were somebody who just wanted to make something for the craft of it, it was going to be harder for you to find an audience and harder for you to become sustainable over time. And this is why PRX, this last bullet point is very much where PRX comes in and tries to combat this every day. Today, are we in a fifth wave? Probably yes, but really it feels kind of more like a continuation of a fourth wave. But this is where we are currently, and this is where a lot of the economic business struggles are happening across the industry. Um, uh, actually, so wait, hold on. I might be getting ahead of myself. So today we are seeing expanded globalization versus hyperlocalization of content. So at the same time that we're seeing more and more countries and creators internationally get into podcasting as a content space, we're also seeing a pivot, especially in the US, towards the hyperlocalization of content. And so public radio stations are really capitalizing on this moment as well to say that we can provide you great shows, great stories, great content that feel extremely personal and authentic to you and where you live and the community you live in. So two things are happening at once, which is really exciting. So because audiences are looking for hyper local in a lot of ways, the more niche a podcast can be, oftentimes that isn't as bad as we think it is. The rise of video. So how many of you uh, primarily consume audio or consume podcast over video or have kids or family members who use YouTube? Yep, Cheryl says depends on the subject, right? Okay. Love YouTube podcasts from Chris. So an interesting development is that about 84%, somewhere between 80 and 90% of Gen Z, so anybody under the age of 30 currently, almost primarily consume all podcasts over video. And that is something that we are trying to figure out as an organization, as an industry. Where does video start versus audio? Where does it end? Where are going to be the most economically viable places to be in terms of video? So we are actually, but the important thing is we're seeing that people are wanting to consume audio as video, or at the very least access audio through YouTube, and that is a very interesting development for us. Um, we globally are, I don't know if I believe that we're probably still in some economic dire straits, but starting in 2022, we're noticing huge economic dips across all industries, particularly in media, but especially in podcasting, um, which led to an ad and sponsorship slump between 2022 and now. I think we're slowly starting to regain some of that ad revenue today, but for 2 years we were seeing advertisers really recoil from giving money to new media ventures to take risks in podcasting, which affects not only creators' abilities to make, but networks and distributors to be able to make money as well. We saw a lot of layoffs and shutterings of podcast units. This was happening at Spotify. This was happening at Odyssey, at public radio stations. We saw Spotify close their original productions unit. We saw public radio stations close original productions. It's been a really rough time in podcasting. We're also seeing an end to flashy acquisitions and building those big catalogs. So, of the fourth wave, we were talking about big acquisitions, right? The bigger the catalog, the bigger the portfolio, the better, the more volume. But they were realizing that actually, the more you get, the more you have to sustain as well. So, we're seeing less of these flashy acquisitions and these building of big catalogs, and a focus more on really keen and intentional marketing efforts around flagship and curated productions and curated properties. So, a lot of these networks now are really taking time to build around audience and focusing on quality over quantity. Do we have any questions in the Q&A about the history? I don't know where the next wave is, what the sixth wave is going to be, or what if it's going to be a continuation of the fourth wave. But certainly, I think that we are starting to see the economic conditions lift a bit, and we're starting to see companies have to realize having to answer the call of video. The question from Sean, why would it have been difficult for independents during the fourth wave? I'm not following. Okay, so the fourth wave was a time of big corporate acquisition and corporate wealth. What they wanted was flashy, what they wanted was celebrity, what they wanted was high experience. So people who had been in audio for a long time, maybe were already professional radio producers or had been working for TV at some point. This was also the time that we were seeing the Joe Rogan experience really kick off. That led to things like um, celebrity podcasts like Julia Louis-Dreyfus podcast, the Smartless podcast, all these big celebrity endeavors where most of the wealth was going towards paying them and not towards independent creators who had new ideas and new shows that they would pitch. Does that make sense? Yeah. So basically, big companies said, we want big celebrity names. We want things that are sure hits that we can make money on and that we can get engagement on. And that level of risk, specifically around independent producers making limited series, these beautiful works or these very personal works, weren't being noticed because of that. Any other questions before we move on to the next section? All right, let's talk about podcast listening. So this is just a lot of data that we're going to go through. This is directly pulled from the Infinite Dial, which is that report that I told you comes out every year. It's a very fascinating webinar. The hosts of that webinar are real kooky dudes that give off like funny uncle vibes. So you might enjoy that. But okay, so this stuff is really interesting. So podcasting familiarity for total US population 12 years and up. So this is just the percentage of people who became aware of podcasting. They may not have listened to it, but like your grandmother, your great aunt, they know what the word podcasting is. They maybe even Googled it or asked somebody about it, right? We are at 84% of the US population 12 and up. That's about 241 million people who have ever heard of the term podcasting and know what a podcast is. We see here, right, around 2014, 2015, we jumped from 49% to 55%. This is right where that serial boom was happening. This is right when the fourth wave was happening, right around here. All right, so all these numbers will start to go down bit by bit. The percentage of podcast listening of US population 12 and up goes down to 67% as of 2024. That's 192 million people who have ever listened to a podcast. They tried, they dabbled, they said, yes, I've listened to a podcast. We're over half of the American population. That's pretty exciting. This number will only continue to grow. All right, now we get to the point where we're starting to see some level of regularity in listening. These are people who have listened to podcasts at least on a monthly basis, at least one podcast a month. We're not at 50% of the US population yet. That's 47%. It's about 135 million people who have listened to a podcast in the past month. We see a dip here in between 2021 and 2022. Does anyone want to venture a guess what happened? Going once, going twice. Yeah, it's late for COVID, Sean. Exactly. George, you raised your hand. Do you want to put your answer in the chat, or do you want to? I don't know how I unmute you. I don't know if I can, but right. Well, I'll say that it is late for COVID, and around this time is when return to office was happening. And so what's really interesting about podcasting is that there was a misconception a long time ago, probably around the mid 2010s, the early 2010s, that podcast listening felt similar to radio listening. And so if you've ever heard that like the length of a perfect podcast is the length of the average American commute, which is anywhere between 25 and 28 minutes, it was because for a while podcasting and public radio listening or radio listening really were conflated. They thought that people engaged with them the same way. Obviously, what happened though, what was true is that people weren't listening to podcasts in the same way people were listening to radio. And so what podcasts really tie themselves to is places of habit. So for some people that is commuting to work or on a train, in a car, on a bus. But for a lot more people, listening to podcasts was tied to third space activities like washing the dishes, doing chores, going for walks, walking the dog, um, all that kind of stuff. And so people saw a boom in podcasting in the pandemic because they were adjusting to new habits and they realized you could listen to podcasts when you went for a walk. You could do these things. We saw a kind of a fairly significant drop as COVID was ending, quote unquote, and people were returning to office because they were having to recalibrate their habits again. If they weren't listening to podcast driving because they hadn't been driving for so long, they essentially weren't listening to podcasts. And so we saw a dip. But then an interesting part about it is that when we go back to 2023, once return to office was starting to become more regular again, and people were adapting to new habits, we saw podcast listening go up and go up past the rate it was the year prior. Interesting. All right. So let's disaggregate some of this data as well for monthly podcast listening around gender lines. And so we'll see here on the left, men, here on the right, women from 2021 to 2024. Um, an observation here, a pretty clear one, is that men clearly have dominated podcast listening for the past 4 years. But what has been interesting in 2024 is that we are seeing the closest gender equity across listening that we've ever seen in the industry. And that's exciting. Um, that means that there are more listeners, but that also means that there are more creators who are women. Um, there's a lot more advertising opportunity for women-led podcasts. And so this means good things. All right, let's do it around age. Another very obvious piece of data here is that the ages 12 to 34 also dominate the listening space. But we're also seeing parity between the 12 and 34 range, as well as the 35 to 54 range. They've stayed pretty closely aligned with each other over the years. We've also seen a pretty momentous jump from 55 plus to from 55 plus from 21% to 27%. And this is an important piece of data for me because I think that we always assume that podcast listeners are young, that podcast listeners are Gen Z or podcast listeners are millennial, but we are seeing that there is a growth in people who are 55 plus. Does that mean that people who are currently 55 plus have been converted to podcasts? That's part of it. Another piece of it is that people who were listening to podcasts in their early 50s and their late 40s are now aging into this group. And so I imagine that the 55 plus age group in the next 10 to 15 years will continue to grow because people who've developed the podcast listening habit in their as elder millennials or as Gen Xers they'll take the habit with them. And so this leads to a very complicated discussion that I have as a person who looks at content and develops content and understanding if age is the more important marker or if generational research is the more important marker that to follow. And so yeah, because one day Gen Zers will be 55 plus and we can't assume that they're going to be like the 55 plus year olds who are in existence today. So there's a lot of like generational cultural research that's being put into media habits now, and it's really exciting. I don't have an answer on how to make content for Gen Zers who are going to age up one day, but it is an interesting delineation between age and generation. All right. So now we're jumping to weekly podcast listeners. This is now people who are habitual podcast listeners. This is the kind of person who would say podcasts are a hobby of theirs. Podcasts are in the rotation as often as music, movies, TV shows, and books. This number obviously is much, much lower. That's only about 34%, just over a third of the US population 12 and up. That's 98 million. We are really excited going into 2025 because Edison and Triton believe that we're going to crest the 100 million in 2025 of weekly podcast listeners. The weekly podcast listener community, that population is a community that sustains podcasting. These are the people that advertisers are looking for. These are the people who are keeping feeds alive by being engaged. So if you are a person who listens to at least one podcast every week or listens to the same podcast weekly, you are contributing to the economy of podcasting. So thank you so much. So this is just if we were to kind of look at this in a more visual place, um, inverted triangle of everyone who's not aware to listen in the last week. At one point, this triangle was inverted, and now we see that majority of people, that more and more people are listening regularly than have never heard of it before. All right. Those are the numbers, and an important thing to note is that those numbers are extremely top line, very surface level. Even Triton and Edison have separate reports specifically for for different racial groups, for different genders, and there are also tons of different independent research agencies that have disaggregated that data to specific listening communities. And if I were to give you a presentation that coalesced all that data, we would be here for weeks. And so we wanted to just give you the baseline understanding of the US population as a whole. All right, podcast discovery. This part is also really fun. How are people finding out about podcasts? I'm curious to know in the chat how you all look for podcasts or how you decide to listen to them. So we're going to split this up into essentially three: word of mouth from Bree. Yes, old school podcast app. Are you searching on the app, Sean, or are you just or yes, searching. Interesting. That is so cool. I know that SEO on discoverability and SEO on podcast apps is still pretty rough. And so I'm very curious. That's so interesting. Word of mouth, mentions by other podcasts. Um, oh, you'll hear something and then look it up. You're not like searching business in Spotify or Apple. I'm not cool. Great. Um, very cool. So still essentially then, Sean, it's word of mouth for you. You'll hear it from somebody. Yeah. Great. Okay, so we're going to split up this section of podcast discovery into three chapters. We're going to talk about the saturation of podcasts, how many podcasts do people listen to, and how are people finding new podcasts. So this is a website called the Podcast Index. It measures how many podcasts are out there right now. I pulled this 2 days ago, so this is probably already old data. But there are currently, the Podcast Index measures that there are over 4.3 million podcasts that are currently in existence. About 111,000 were published just in the last 3 days. Now, this is extremely overwhelming. Stefan, did you have a question? Apologies, I don't know how to unmute people. Oh, wait, yes, I do. I do. Stefan, I can allow you to talk. Did you have a question?
No, I'm sorry. I think I hit the thing.
Okay, no worries. I will now revoke your ability to talk. Okay. Cool. Okay. So this is extremely overwhelming, right? Like, I want to make a podcast. How in the world am I supposed to stand out amongst 4.3 million podcasts and hundreds of thousands that are produced every week? A really important piece of this information, though, is that less than 4% of podcasts have more than 10 episodes and produced a new one in the last week. That means 96% of podcasts in existence are really not active shows. So as you can imagine, there are the podcast directory in Apple, in Spotify. There is a graveyard of shows that were either limited series and no longer producing, shows that maybe started an account, posted one piece of audio to try things out, and then never went back to it, or shows that just sunset or canceled or just are no longer in production. And so while there are from a pure quantity perspective, there's 4.3 million individual things that are tagged as podcasts in the app. A vast majority of them, 96% of them, are not active. And that always means that there's an opportunity for somebody to come in and produce something that can be seen. So we're really talking about a competition of 4% of that, which is still a lot, but it is better than 4.3 million. Another thing, an interesting fact here too, is that 1 in 4 internet users listen to a podcast. So if you are an active internet user, the likelihood is that 1 out of 4 of your friends, you're actively listening to podcasts. People who consider themselves weekly podcast listeners or habitual podcast listeners say they tune in to 8 podcast episodes a week. How many do you listen to? I'll say that I listen to probably like 25 a week, but that's purely for work. I don't know that I've listened for leisure in a really, really long time. I'd probably say one or two. Four, three. Cool. There is a piece of data, I don't think I have it here. Yeah. So there's a piece of data that I really love seeing that the average weekly podcast listener listens to about 8 podcasts a week. And a small percentage of them listen to 8+, 9+, listen to 12. So Sean, you would be in the upper echelon of podcast listeners listening to 12 or more. But there are now more people who listen to 8+ than there are who listen to fewer than 8. And something that we help independent creators think about when they're trying to make something, um, if I listen to the competition and for fun, great. Something that we tell independent creators when making something is that your goal is essentially to make something that's going to make an average podcast listener move you into one of their 8 slots. That's something to think about, right? Like that's not obviously you won't it's not you're not going to unseat a spot for every podcast listener, but if you can get one podcast listener who listens to 8 to unseat one episode that they're listening to listen to yours, that is success. That is kind of the benchmark we're working with. All right. I asked how you all listen to podcasts. Word of mouth remains the primary form of discovery of podcasts, about 55%. I think that number is actually probably much higher. I'm not really sure how people are measuring 55%, but word of mouth, I think word of mouth also could be considered a lot of different things. So your friend told you, a coworker told you, you read about it on a Reddit thread, you heard about it on TikTok, you heard about somebody else's podcast on a podcast you're listening to. That all counts as different forms of word of mouth. We are not we're not finding podcasts as regularly through Google search. We're not, surprisingly enough, like ads and like like boosted social posts is not the way to do it. The algorithms are not as helpful in that place, in that respect, as we'd like it to be. So the likelihood is you're listening to a podcast because someone you told you about it or you heard about it somewhere. Okay. But aside from personal recommendations, Sounds Profitable did a study asking where else do you go to find podcasts or how else do you hear about them? And what we're seeing here is that outside of word of mouth, YouTube searching is the obvious predominant winner here of how people are looking or how people are discovering podcasts. Searching on the internet for me still feels weird. I don't know what they mean by searching on the internet. I think I was talking to Sean and I was asking, are you searching like business? Are you searching lifestyle? And the answer was no. It was I heard about something and I was looking for it on the internet. So I'm actually very curious. Um, I'm actually very curious if searching on the internet is actually like a pure organic search, like new podcasts question mark, or if people are looking for things they hear about on the internet. See recommendation from another podcast host. This is a smaller, like a subset of word of mouth, I believe. A mention on a website, all these things. I don't know what other is. Oh, actually, I did have a funny slide that I put together a long time ago of all the strange ways people have discovered a podcast. And a couple of the ones that stood out to me was they saw somebody in line at Starbucks wearing a T-shirt for a podcast. They looked it up. That's like, I mean, that is marketing, but that's also is word of mouth in a way. Another one was podcast stickers in bathroom stalls. Um, Another one, just overhearing people talking about it in lines at restaurants and other tables. And so there's just a lot of ways that you can hear about them. All right. Okay. Audience trends. This part is fun. I'm going to subset this into podcast charts, the video to podcast discovery pipeline, and what I call micro communities and how audiences are really developing around these micro communities. All right. So one thing before we go forward, actually, that there are 3 predominant ranking and like data sites that track performance of podcasts and rank them essentially. A really important caveat to understanding podcast rankings is that podcasting, one of its greatest strengths is that it is not a centralized media ecosystem the way that TV and film are, which means that there aren't a lot of rules for how podcasts can be made or how they can be published or all these things. Um, the bad part about being a decentralized media format is that it's really hard to track data, and there really isn't a universal, agreed upon, implemented standard for podcast performance. And so that means that podcasts do not have to share their data with anybody. Um, there's no governing body that asks for people to report on how their performance went. There's no governing body that talks about basic universal standards or performance. And so all these podcast ranking charts have their own ways of devising who is ranking and who isn't. And often it's opt-in. It's polling and it's people who opt into it. So again, all of the data I'm about to show you is take it with a grain of salt. The important thing to remember is that the data is inconclusive about a lot of these things, and that none of the what you see as trending should be an indication of what you have to do, specifically because we have the benefit of podcasting being a niche place that really leverages niche communities. I'm going to go to the Q&A really quick. Clint asks, I listen to NY Times, New York Times podcast. Would you consider that a podcast app or something different? I read the news on the app as well. Oh, that's interesting. It is an app, but it isn't an app in the traditional sense because the New York Times isn't feeding in the entire catalog of podcasts. And so they that's a really good example, Clint, of how podcast data becomes so decentralized because people who decide to listen to the daily on their app versus the daily on Spotify or the daily on Apple really bifurcates and disaggregates data in a way that makes it really hard to track. And so you might listen to New York Times podcasts on the app, but you can't listen to anything else. I'm gonna from George as well. Last year I was diagnosed with early age stage Alzheimer's. I'm so sorry about that, George. As a veteran documentary filmmaker and Peabody winner on PRI's platform at the time, great. We were PRX was PRI. I determined to determine the figurative cameras on myself and tell the story of my journey with the disease from the inside. Ultimately, I am making a film. In the process, I have started a vlog on Instagram, adding a YouTube channel next month, and evaluating adding a podcast in 2025. Interested in how best to approach the podcast element as an experienced audio video storyteller without a track record in the field. I'm also a member of AIR. That's a big question, George. I'm actually like really open to talking to you specifically about this one-on-one because that could be a very long office hours discussion. But essentially, I would say that the YouTube channel could be your way into the podcast. I would not duplicate the effort, especially if you are a single member of a team. There could be a way to formulate a YouTube channel that translates to audio. So we can talk about that. Maybe Clint and Chris, if there is a way to connect with George after this, I'm happy to get that going with them. Okay. All right. So again, the caveat of do not take this so seriously. This is just what a couple of research entities figured out by calling a lot of people and asking them what they listen to. So the daily, so this is in order. So from left to right and then down, it's 1 through 10. So these are top 10 podcasts according to PodTrack, which is one. This is also a website that I would tab in your bookmarks if you want to like keep up with what's going on. So the daily is number 1. NPR News Now is 2. Up First is 3. Dateline, The Dan Bongino Show, Morbid, Armchair Expert, Fox News Hourly Update, Pardon My Take, and Stuff You Should Know. A couple of shows used to be on here, including Smartless. That has dropped from the top 10, which is interesting. What are we noticing about these shows? What are kind of the big categories or big trends you see here? Established. Very good. These are legacy shows that have been around for at least 5 years. News and Guys. I love that. Yep, News and Guys. This chart in particular goes into the 3 main categories of podcast trends that I see today, which is guys with opinions, The news and murder is a lot of what the three big things. Very white, yes, agreed. All right. So keep this. Does anyone listen to anything on this? Anybody a fan? Anyone listen to the Dan Bongino show? I know nothing about this one. He makes it into the rankings quite a bit. Yes. Sean, what do you listen to? Are you a daily listener? Armchair expert? First three. News. Perfect. Oh, uh-oh. Okay. All right. This is the next and stuff you should know. All right. Are you a big public radio person? That's what I'm getting. This is what I'm feeling. Okay. So the next one is, yes, just left WBEZ. Okay. Very neat. Okay, so the next tracker is something called Chartable. I like Chartable just a little bit more because they update weekly. So PodTrack does it monthly. Chartable updates weekly. So this will change. This ranking will change next week. So Dateline is number 1. Then we go to Pod Save America, Smart Lists, Morbid, The Megyn Kelly Show. I did not know she had a podcast. The Sean Ryan Show, Stuff You Should Know, Armchair Expert 2020, and My Favorite Murder. So we have some consistencies here. We have Dateline and we have Morbid, we have Armchair Expert, and we have Stuff You Should Know. What we've added though is Smart List is back in the top 10 here. The Megyn Kelly Show was not ranking or tracking for us 6 months ago, even 3 months ago, and now she's number 5 according to Chartable. The Sean Ryan Show also comes in and out of the top 10 pretty often. Stuff You Should Know is pretty consistent. My Favorite Murder is also a show that pops in and out of the rankings for us quite often. Anyone listen to anything here? Cool. So yeah, so we can already see where the two different rankings are starting to deviate. And so this is where I start to say, you can start to see how it starts to get a little unreliable here. Finally, Edison is another tracker. Edison tracks quarterly. Before they used to track annually, but then they started tracking quarterly. This is as of Q2 of 2024. So now we go into the Joe Rogan Experience as number 1. Crime Junkie, The Daily, Call Her Daddy, Dateline, Smart List, Stuff You Should Know, This American Life, This Past Weekend with Theo Vaughn, and Morbid. I think the introduction of the Joe Rogan Experience, so some Spotify exclusives here are really interesting. I think Edison, I think the way that Edison does its polling is that it does put Spotify on an equal playing field, or I don't know how they do it, but Spotify exclusives come up more often in Edison. I'm not sure why. But we see that there are what are the shows that have kind of survived all three of the different rankings? Morbid. See it? Not even the Daily, yeah. So Morbid, Dateline, and Stuff You Should Know kind of has outlived all three of the shows of the three of the rankings. And I still think that the general theme of dudes with opinions, crime, and news / public radio still feels pretty relevant here, as it does in this one as well. What are some thoughts you have about seeing these podcast rankings? I know some of you probably listened to some of these. I gave you the takeaway, which is none of these are all very these are all very important established shows. As we get into the top 20 of shows, we start to see a bit more public radio. But really the top 10 to top 15, all of these shows are bouncing between each other constantly. I think in the last few years, there's only been 1 or 2 shows that are completely independent, which means that they're not produced and distributed by a company like Earwolf or Spotify. They're completely independently owned and operated. Only 1 or 2 shows have made it into the top 100 in the past 5 years. And so that goes back to the earlier question of like, why is it harder for independents? Because Joe Rogan, Jason Bateman and Will Arnett and Alex Cooper from Call Her Daddy, the heft and the marketing weight um, of NBC and all these big networks, they are the ones taking up a lot of the space. And so it's much harder for independents to make it into the top 100. Whereas when I first started in podcasting in 2017, there were several independent shows that were in the top 100. Some of these shows were independent before they got bought out. All right. This is also a really interesting thing that I found, a consumer survey, a sentiment survey about generations and how they interact with content. So I like this versus age groups because age groups, generational culture is not tied to age, essentially. So Gen Z loves entertainment, learning, and filling time. Do we have any Gen Zers out there in the chat? Secunda says, I've heard of some, listened to some, like Nor outside of the podcast. This makes me think, how can I be successful as an independent Black woman in different type of content? It's a great question. Again, this is where we start to leverage the idea of niche communities, and that breaking the top 100 of podcasts is not the only way to find success. And we'll get into that in a minute. Millennials love learning, financial news, and breaking news. Gen X loves learning, breaking news, and financial news. And boomers love politics, breaking news, and financial news. I don't know what quite to do with this data yet, but I think it's interesting that filling time is something. And I think a lot of talk shows, a lot of chat casts are where filling time comes into place. All right. So now let's talk about the video to podcast discovery pipeline. So YouTube as a platform has been growing since 2019. As of October of last year, YouTube made up 28% of podcast consumption, followed by Spotify and Apple Podcasts. YouTube is the number one for podcast discovery outside of word of mouth, which we saw earlier. People were going to YouTube to find things. And this is 84% of Gen Z monthly podcast listeners who listen to or watch podcasts with a video component. So this is where a rise of video can mean different things. A rise of video can mean straight video podcasts like New Heights with the Kelsey brothers, where they're just filming their show on video, or that there is some level of video engagement. So marketing teams will they'll film all episodes, but then they'll clip sections, like the most viral sections, the most interesting and salient sections, and put them on TikTok, put them on YouTube Reels, put them on or YouTube Shorts or Instagram Reels, and they use that as a discovery tool because I said discovery on podcast apps is really hard. So they'll clip pieces of their work, they'll clip pieces of their show and put them into platforms that have stronger discovery algorithms like Instagram and Gen Z. I have Gen Z kids, and filling time plus YouTube equals life. That is my niece and nephew as well. Sometimes I'll just walk into their room and they'll just be like, YouTube will just be on and they aren't even like watching it. It's like white noise. Okay. So an important thing to know about video that I'm going to just stress for you all as well is that we are at the very early stages of video becoming industry standard, and that I would never encourage an independent producer to try to do audio and video at the same time unless they had the capacity. There's a way to level up into video, or there's a way to either decide to do video and rip audio as a one-to-one. It's a lot of work to do video production. It is a lot of money to do video production. And I would say do it if you have the resources, but don't if you don't, and think about how you could level up and grow into video over time. Also, if your listeners are not Gen Zers, don't worry about video. Like if you want to reach people who are millennials and up, if you want to reach boomers or Gen Xers, they are not watching podcasts on YouTube. They are listening. And so part of your decisions around what to do with your podcast largely built around who your audience is going to be as well. All right. So let's talk about micro communities or niche within a niche. There is an old adage that we used to say, very cliche, that podcasts are an embarrassment of niches. And that's because podcasts are a really personalized experience. People are going to podcasts to feel connected to a very specific community, a very specific subject matter. Um, Podcast advertising had such a high return on investment for so long because people wanted to hear what their favorite podcast hosts were recommending them to do. They developed these parasocial bonds, these like friendships with the people that they hear on their podcast. It is not the same as television and is not the same as film. People are going to podcasts to really establish their own personalized identity. There are a lot of exceptions to that. I think there are some things like generalized news podcasts. There are like pretty big and big true crime podcasts that kind of transcend all of that. But a podcast that is meant for broad appeal or meant for all is essentially a podcast for nobody. And so we really think that because people, especially podcast listeners, are very keen on authenticity, on personalization, on feeling seen, feeling heard, that the way to break through the noise of the top 100 and those corporate acquisitions and that consolidation of wealth is to really make something for the niche community that you know is going to come back to you and support you over time. So if any of you are thinking, I want a podcast to be a big hit that gets hundreds of thousands of downloads, that is not likely in your first year or even your third year. I'm not saying that it's impossible, it's just not likely. And so rather than focusing on big numbers out the gate, focus on building strong bonds with a community of listeners that you want to reach. And these are some examples of shows that have done that. Has anyone listened to Acquired? It is a business tech show that kind of gives the stories and the insights behind America's biggest companies and industries. Okay. So Acquired is an independent podcast that has somehow really gotten so look at it, it's on season 14, by the way, so it's 14 seasons of this show. This is an independent podcast developed by two tech guys who left the industry and decided to do a podcast about the companies and the business people and the CEOs that they either admired or were very confused about. And it took them 14 seasons to get to this level of prestige. But in those 14 seasons, what they were doing was they were building a community of people who considered themselves the smartest people in the room. I don't know that I agree with this, but this is what they believed to be true, that they were targeting people who really cared about the esoteric, granular details about business development and tech development. It's not quite how I built this, which is kind of a narrative approach to how big companies come together. It's very nerdy, it's wonky, it's in the weeds. We're talking about companies from Costco to Spotify to Tesla to Nvidia, all these big companies. But it took them 14 seasons to get to a place where JP Morgan wanted to be their presenting sponsor. 14 seasons. And they really built a strong community around the nerds, the tech nerds and the business nerds, and they grew over time, and now they're selling out stadiums, and they are one of the most sought after shows in the industry. They are still completely independent. They are not distributed by anybody. They're not owned by anybody. They're not a part of a larger network. They're completely independent. It doesn't feel that way because JP Morgan's on their tile, but JP Morgan just gave them money for the season. Another example is Chapo Trap House. Does anyone listen to Chapo Trap House? Or has anyone heard of Chapo Trap House? Chris listens to Chapo Trap House. Nope. Quick backstory about Chapo Trap House. It is I'm going to call it, pardon me for anyone who listens, like a leftist bro podcast. Does that seem fair? A leftist bro podcast. My husband listens to Chapo Trap House, but it is essentially built around guys who are friends. They're leftists. They talk about politics. They talk about culture. Um, they are not. They don't chart anywhere. They're not in the top 100. They probably get about 120,000 downloads a month. That's not a lot. not by industry standards by any mean. At PRX, we kind of talk about extra large shows that are million plus downloads a month, large shows that are about 150 plus. They're somewhere in like the large range of shows. So they're not even at the peak of what is like possible. They haven't even hit the cap of what's possible. So about 120,000 downloads a month. It is by no means one of the biggest shows in the industry. They're not in the top 100. They rarely are, and actually not that many people know about them. But I want to point out their Patreon, their membership model. They have 49,000, nearly 50,000 members on their Patreon, and they make $172,000 a month from a very dedicated following of 50,000 people. This is a show that is not in the top 100. It is also, I believe, independent. They don't have big marketing funds. They don't have celebrities behind them. This is an independent podcast that's built a following around people who are leftist bros, essentially. And they make more money than a lot of the top 100 shows do. It's $173,000 a month. And that's without advertising dollars. Is it only published via a Patreon paywall? No, they have exclusive content, and I believe that I don't know what they do specifically because I don't listen. I can ask my husband, but some things that they do on Patreon is every other episode will be behind paywall, or bonus content will be behind paywall, or some instances they shows like this will release an ad-free version for their members. My husband is a Patreon subscriber to another show called All Fantasy Everything, and their members get ad-free feeds every week, and earlier, like a day earlier, ad-free. And also, what is it? Priority registration, priority ticket sales for all their live events, which are very, very, very popular and sell out. So again, 50,000 members is again like another huge goal to hit. But I think the moral of the story here is that you don't have to be in the top 100 to find your success. If you do a really, really good job speaking to the people that you've decided is your community and the people that you've built up to be your listener base. And so you could have a Patreon of 50 members and and you make $100 a month. That's $100 more dollars. That's 100 more dollars than you had before. And that's without you even having to be the top performing podcast in their eyes. You just are the podcast that they like. I had an independent podcast for a few years that was what we would call medium success, about 45,000 downloads a month. This was back in 2016 too, so 45 was actually quite big. But we had a Patreon of about 800 members, and we made about $1,400 a month. Some of them only contributed a dollar each. But that $1,400 made it so that we didn't have to pay for any of our production out of pocket ever again. We were also able to do a Kickstarter that raised $25,000, which is really interesting. We had a Kickstarter for a second season that raised $25,000 because the people that we built up in that first season loved what we were doing so much that they were willing to give us that money. And we were by no means a big show. We did pretty well for who we were, but we were independent. We had not made it into the podcast charts. We were not being written about. We were not making to end of year lists. We just had people who really cared about us, and we made 25,000 that paid for a lot of expenses, and then we had a regular cash flow of 1,400 every month that made it so that we didn't have to lose money. We weren't making money. We never wanted to make money on the show, but we weren't losing money, which is kind of like the next best thing. Okay. Sustainability, monetization, well, multiple offerings and budget and scale. So let's talk about the realities of making money. Okay. So this is me coming in from, again, a very top-down perspective. So this isn't applicable to everybody. There are workarounds to all of this information. But just so you know what some of the top performers are dealing with and what the industry is dealing with as a whole, limited series are almost impossible to monetize. So these are things like, so if Serial had only come out with one season and never again, and they went around asking people for money or for ads on that show, if they were to do that today, no one, if they didn't have the Serial name, for instance, if it wasn't Serial, if it wasn't the New York Times, it wasn't This American Life, and they just had a great series, no matter how good it was, and they shopped it around, PRX would have said no because we couldn't make the money. Sales happen at sustained volume. this makes sense. Advertisers want the most number of people to hear their ads the most number of times. A limited series usually is from 6 to 12 episodes. It's a limited quantity, a limited opportunity for advertisers to get their work into the ad inventory. And they probably have to share it with other advertisers. They really only have 12 shots to do it. It's just the ROI on that is low. So we often have to, PRX is happy to distribute limited series, but if one of those goals is like, we need to make money on this, we usually have to turn them away. That's the realities of limited series. What is it? Oh, so really we start to see monetization. I think this sign is backwards, but we start to see monetization potential. So national monetization potential, not local, not regional, like big brands like Progressive, Casper Mattress, Fresh Direct, some of these big brands, Toyota, AT&T. We see national monetization potential happen at the minimum 75,000 downloads per episode per 28 days. So that seems an impossible scale, right? Again, this is not applicable to all. There are so many independent producers out there who make money outside of these big advertisers, who make money with no ads whatsoever. But this is the benchmark of the industry. 75,000 downloads per episode per 28 days gets you to about $30,000 to $60,000 annually in revenue. 30,000 is what we consider a very conservative goal. 60,000 would be a stretch goal. That's what we're seeing. So yeah. But so this is a big caveat here. There's a lot of untapped potential and direct brand sponsorships with smaller brands. And so something that my podcast did, it was local to Portland. That's where the podcast was first originated. I wasn't a founding member of that podcast, but I did produce remotely for them. But it was founded and produced out of Portland. They weren't getting money from Whole Foods or Apple or any of these things, but they were able to secure some monthly sponsorships at about 150 per episode. From a small winery and a small food co-op in Portland that really saw and identified and aligned themselves with the podcast listeners. And so they knew that they were going to see a high return on investment because they knew the listeners of our podcast were the most likely to use their brands or use their services. And so we only made $150 an episode from them, so it's about $300 a month. Again, it contributed to us not having to pull out of our own pocket to produce our show. But that is an example of a lot of untapped potential for small brands. Local brands, local businesses, you can go to them and say, I believe that my podcast is going to be a hit amongst the people who are most likely to use your coffee shop or use your restaurant or use your brand. Can we negotiate something that's small, that could help me alleviate costs? And so when we move out of the like big industry conversations, you also release yourself from like these really rigid standards and rigid benchmarks. And so while the 75,000 download per episode thing comes with a lot of caveats around CPMs, which is cost per meal of downloads, and all these types of things, you could go to a local sponsor and just say, how about $100 a month? And they would be like, sure. And you would negotiate what that would look like for them. That would be a shout out in the episode, one ad in the middle of the episode, very negotiable, very flexible. And so there is just a lot of untapped potential. I don't want anyone to think that the only way to do any business in the industry is to look at what Joe Rogan is doing or what Call Her Daddy is doing or what Progressive Insurance is doing. There's so much out there, and the great thing about some of these smaller brands is that they're not as fluent in how podcast advertising works, and so you can just work out a deal with them. You can come to a mutually beneficial agreement that doesn't have to rely on industry standards or industry benchmarks. So the important thing for you all is to calibrate your idea of success appropriately. If your goal is to make $1 million out the first year, I mean, allow me to be that cold bucket of water and say that's probably not likely unless you are Joe Rogan or unless you are Celine Dion or something. But you can say, I want to be able to make back what I put in. So maybe I bought a recorder for $700. I would like to make back a $700 so that I can break even on production. That's a very reasonable goal. Um, by year 2, year 3, I would like to at least have I would like to have 2% more in my account than I did or something like that. You can start to stave that off. Some success also has nothing to do with money, and that's totally fine too. Some of you might say like I just want to be able to make something as an opportunity to speak my truth, to express myself. I want to make something that feels very personal. If I hit success, if people pick me up, that's great. But for now, in this first year of production, I'm happy just knowing that I can do it. So there are a lot of different success metrics. Be very intentional about what your idea of success is and be reasonable about what your idea of success is as well. Like I said, podcasts with smaller audience can be podcasts with niche audience. So just small does not mean unsuccessful. Small just means you get to be creative on how you engage them and how you make money and how you sustain yourself over time. These are some examples of very small podcasts that developed their idea of success. This one, Racist Sandwich, is the podcast that I produced. It sounds insane. The concept sounds absolutely deranged, but it is a podcast that came out in 2016 that specifically talked about the intersection of politics, food, race, and gender in class. And its whole thesis was that food is political. It's not something that we just eat. It signals so much about culture, about how we talk to people, all these things. But this is a show that did really well back by 2016 metrics. Today, we would call this a small show. It was a medium show back in 2016. Um, like I said, we were able to leverage the small support of a Patreon membership of people who were super fans who wanted to give us between $1 and $5 a month, and they did it consistently. Um, and then plus a couple of small local sponsors that totaled us out at about 1,400 a month. First Issue Club is a podcast that our director of audience growth at PRX used to run. They also were able, because they were so niche, they were a podcast specifically about the first issue of comics. They were able to capture comic book nerds, like people who are really into it. Comic book nerds spend money on conferences, they spend money on merchandise. And so anytime anybody that they approached for like small sponsorships were so excited to do it because they knew that the comic book nerd community would spend money. So they weren't, again, they probably made about as much money, maybe a little bit more than I did, but they were able to pay all 4 members of their team, not pay, but not make them lose money essentially for 4 members of their team. Songwriter is a show that I would say gets very few downloads. I'd say like in the low thousands of downloads. But they have such a strong point of view and such a strong narrative around music that they make all their money from grants. They are exceptional grant writers and they are exceptional pitchers about the value of their work and the position that it plays, and the impact that their stories have on the people that listen to them, that they get tens of thousands of dollars a year in grant funding alone. And this is a show that does not, by most standards, do well if we're looking at the charts. Copper and Heat is another food show. Actually, Racist Sandwich and Copper and Heat were very good friends. We were both from Portland, but they won a James Beard Award one year, which really opened up a bunch of opportunities. James Beard, like these types of awards, also do tend to that do leave room open for a lot of independent, non-celebrity podcasts, and winning awards isn't always the best like audience play, but it is a really good business play. So if you win an award, if you submit yourself for an award and you win one, you get noticed by other organizations, by other companies, by other podcasters for collaboration opportunities, X, Y, and Z. So, yeah, but how they make their money, in addition to having their own Patreon, is that they do white label productions. And so these two are experienced audio producers. They have part-time jobs producing content for other brands and for other organizations. And that funding that they get funnels back into their show. Are they making a profit? Probably not, but they're basically using their skills applied elsewhere to fund their passion project, which is Copper and Heat. Other Men Need Help with Mark Pagan is a show made by a very dear friend of mine who also used to work at PRX. He's been doing this show for several years now. He's still independent, downloads in the low 10,000s. But he makes money off of something that he calls his Hubba Hubba series. So Other Men Need Help is a show basically dismantling toxic masculinity and really approaching manhood and boyhood through a lens of nurturing and care and empathy. And it means opening up about, insecurity, attraction, relationships, love. And he has a series called Hubba Hubba, which is completely separate from Other Men Need Help. It's a film series where he screens movies about all of our crushes, the crushes that men had on boys and girls in time. And we feature a crush every month. And they host a screening and they tape like a bonus kind of audio series around discussions around attraction and romantic feelings and who we have crushes on. And they rent out a movie theater every month for this, and they make pretty good money on it too. So it's that's just another thing that they were able to put together that isn't the podcast itself. So these are just examples of really small communities that were able to figure out how to make money despite not having commercial success. All right, multiple offerings. This is what I'm going to say is a level up opportunity, but we like to think about podcast in 2024 and beyond as the flagship of an ecosystem that you will one day create around yourself as a brand. And so how you do this is you create multiple points of entry for people to engage with you. So maybe podcasts aren't the way that your audience is going to find you. Maybe you have a blog. Maybe you have a YouTube series like George Bull. Maybe you have other work or you have a really strong social media presence. And you use all of this to create an ecosystem of work. And what that allows people to do is it allows people to find you the way that they are more organically to find you. So you create multiple points of entry for them, but you also expand your prism of success and of metrics. And so, um, just because your podcast doesn't get a lot of downloads, maybe your social media gets a lot of engagement. How do you recalibrate your success metrics to say, well, my podcast gets this many downloads, my brand overall has this much engagement and this much visibility? And so, again, this is like a level up situation. But if you are someone who already has a pretty successful blog or a successful social media channel, use that as a way to direct people into a new product, right? Leverage your own ecosystem that you've created. And this is a way to just have as many diverse revenue streams as possible and diverse streams of access for your audience. Glory Edom is a podcaster. She actually originally began her podcasting journey by starting a book club. She worked in publishing. She was reading books that people weren't really talking about, and she created a small local book club in the DC area just for Black women to discuss Black authors, Black female authors. And that book club got the attention of book publishers that began sending her books to review, which then grew into her forming a blog. And then she got enough funding and enough visibility over time that her book club, the Well Read Black Girl, turned into a conference that got sponsors. And then that conference caught the eye of Pushkin, and Pushkin wanted to convert Well Read Black Girl, which was a book club, into a podcast. And now she has two podcasts, the book club, the conference, and she's written two books about her journey around literacy and around reading and her passion for reading and writing. And so she was a regular person with a day job in publishing, and now she does this full time. And this took several years to put together, but it was not impossible. So leverage your strengths where they currently are and funnel people into a podcast that way. This is another example. This is a network, a production house and a network called Wonder Media. It's a women owned and operated. It prioritizes women-made shows, women history, women's issues, and this is like a big commercial example of how they diversify their offerings. But essentially, they do white label productions as well. So everything up at the top are their original productions. These are the things that don't make any money, but they feel very passionate about, they care about. It is the pinnacle of their brand. It's what anchors them as a women-owned and operated network. Everything down here is their brand studio. They are making content for Pfizer, for Amazon Music, for DoorDash, Luminary, Coinbase, Spotify. They're making shows for them, taking that cash and funneling it into their passion projects. So this is kind of a way to say that like their day job is making branded content for their passion projects. So there is a way for you all to think about how to leverage different revenue streams to make your content possible. Finally, this is just a conversation of budget and scale. I don't have any slides for this. The first thing you have to do if you want to make money in this day and age is you have to know how much money you need to make, right? And so I want you all, if monetizing is a goal in your first 3 years of making a show one day, I need you all to write down a budget, make a budget. How much does your time cost on an hourly basis? How much would it cost for you to hire an editor or to just like pay your friend to help you do things? How much will software cost for a year? How much will equipment cost for a year? And just put that in a budget spreadsheet. You won't be able to approach sponsors. You won't be able to ask Patreon subscribers. You won't even know how much you're working with unless you know how much you need. And so my first advice for anybody is try to take some time, sit down and crunch the numbers. You might find that you don't need as much as you thought you did. So maybe the mountain that you thought you had to scale is actually more of a hill, and that might, alleviate some of the stress. And so make that budget, think about how that scales over time, and definitely, definitely do not compare yourself to the people making the news today. They are a very small subset of creators, the tiniest 0.0001% of creators. They have none of these celebrities are producing any of their own shows. They have teams that do it for them. They hop in, they make the money, and they leave. And that is not a reasonable, feasible, or pragmatic benchmark for independent creators. And so my advice in 2024 and beyond is know how much you need. Take some time at the top to be intentional about what you actually want to do and what your goals are around money, around visibility, about growth. Think about who your niche community is and how your content is going to speak to a niche community. Do not ask yourself how you could be the biggest success in the shortest amount of time possible. Your question should be, how can I make the biggest impact amongst the smallest group of people possible? And then the third thing is keep up to date. Um, you now have a very like quick overview of the history of podcasting, but subscribe to those newsletters. Keep track of what the conversations are. Keep track about what the different generations of listeners are doing, and that will all lead to a more informed understanding of how podcasting will work for you today and beyond. That is all I have. And so we have about 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes of questions. And so I know that's not a lot of time, but I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer if people have time as well. So I have here a note from anonymous attendee. I've been horrified at the chummy host-centric nature of podcasts I have listened to recently. It's like a club, uninteresting chit-chat with no relevance to the topic at hand. Is this representative or reflective of the current zeitgeist? I'm coming from a background of neutrality and objectivity. Has the approach disappeared from the medium? I think that that's a complicated question. And then again, it really depends on the audience you're going for. So that kind of like chummy, um, like off topic chat is like, there's a purpose for that. They're not, I mean, they might all be a little bit stupid and not that interesting, or that intentional. But the intent of shows like that is specifically to create a listening experience as if you were a friend sitting at the table with them, right? How many times have you hung out with your friends and you are talking about things and you pivot and you laugh and you say stupid things and you go off topic? And it's meant to emulate conversations with friends so that you can build parasocial bonds with the people that you're listening to. My husband is very much a big fan of the parasocial listening experience. He really sees podcasting as a social tool for community and connection, as opposed to a tool for learning and a tool for like discovery. And so there is a reason that that happens that way. That podcasts, those types of podcasts aren't for everybody. And if you're not interested in that kind of work, you don't have to do that kind of work. Um, that happens to be the most sustainable kind of podcast to make, unfortunately. And so in the marketplace, in the commercial industry of podcasting, these kind of like chummy chit chat, aimless conversations are easy to produce because there's very minimal production involved, which means that there is a lower cost to create. And because they are easy to produce, you can put them out in volume. And because people love the feeling of, and people really grow attached to the hosts, there's a very high return on investment. So that's probably why you're seeing a lot of it from a marketplace standpoint. It is also not the only thing out there. We saw the charts where we saw news is still very big up there. We see true crime is still very big up there. But then if you really funnel that down to your niche listeners, you make the thing that's going to reach out to them the most. Um, Bree, you raised your hand. Would you like to type in the chat or would you like to talk? Let me unmute you in any case. Bree. Okay. Hi, Bree.
Hi, it was a very informative and historically relevant, currency relevant. I just wanted to thank you and then kind of go into some of the things that I learned and would like to apply. I don't know if you have a lot of time for specifics, but I understand edginess and trying to, find out my niche audience. But,
Mhm.
working with current topics, I have a background in theater arts and, using things in very creative ways. So I'd like to launch a hybrid podcast. I want it to be historically relevant, and it's on a historical figure that visited my current city, but it also has these really supernatural overtones with folklore and African American history. So I'm trying to figure out how to best do it, and it's a very edgy title. So I appreciated the honesty and the ones you had working on with the sandwich, the racist sandwich, I think it was called. But
Mhm.
mine's a little bit more deeper. It's so deep that I've been like living this out. Originally wanted it to be a short documentary, but thought that a podcast would be easily because of the nature of the history. Everything during that particular time period was on the radio. So I'm in that frame to try to figure out how to connect with someone like you with this particular idea. As edgy as it is, it's very current and it's played out so interestingly that I just want to thank you for that and then kind of figure out how to talk more about my Zora joint.
Yeah.
But thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. I can also let me just put my email in the chat as well. I obviously I obviously time is precious and I probably can't give you all like hours of my time, but if you want to reach out, we can try to find 30 minutes to make sense of your ideas and figure out what your next step should be. So yeah, my email's in the chat. Take that
Thank you.
and be judicious with it. Thank you.
Oh yeah, also Stephanie, Bree's one of our fiscally sponsored makers as well, and so I know you'll be doing some, some office
Okay.
hours. So Bree, I'll definitely connect you with Stephanie, so you can take advantage
Oh,
of doing that.
perfect, Bree. Yeah, I have office
Yeah,
hours opening up in December for those
yes, yeah.
specific members, and so you'll be able to sign up for that.
But
Any other questions? I can also happy to send this deck out as well, so I'll give it to Chris and the documentary fund folks, and they can give it to you as a PDF. Excellent. Y'all have been really engaging and fun. Oh wait, hold on for 1 second. Sean asked, back in the days of some wave, maybe wave four, everyone recommended getting on someone else's show as a way to grow. Yes, I would say because we see that word of mouth in the form of obviously your friends and network, but also like I heard about somebody on someone else's podcast. It's still a very effective thing to do. So one of the things that, this can either show up as a cross promo, so secure cross promos with shows that you want, or pitch yourself as guests. That is another way to do it as well. It's You would have to kind of level the expectations. Like you have to be on a show of somebody of equal stature, of equal performance, or whatnot. But I would say it's not a bad thing to try. Excellent. Okay, thank you all so much. This was fun. You have my email address, and then I will see some of you at office hours. So
Cool, cool. Thank you again, Stephanie. Thank you again. That was great. Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is some good information. Also, for folks out there who have podcasts, if you're in the South, if you have a podcast that's related to stories in the South, we want to hear from you. You know, we have fiscal sponsorship. We do offer fiscal sponsorship for podcasts. So if you have a Southern type of feel, Southern story based type of podcast, or if you're based in the South and you have a podcast going, reach out to us. Let me put my email in the chat. We would love to talk to you about your project and get you involved in what we have going on. Feel free to reach out at any time to me. Also, Stephanie is actually one of our mentors for a brief period as well. So, like I was saying, Bree is one of our fiscally sponsored makers, so she has access, to Stephanie. So that's why fiscal sponsorship is important. So you saw the knowledge that Stephanie has. You can actually sign up for a one-on-one session with her to go even more in depth. But you have to be fiscally sponsored by us. And so definitely, if you have a podcast, reach out to me, reach out to our organization to see if we can get you involved in our fiscal sponsorship program for podcasts. But again, thank you, Stephanie, for this information and your time. And this has been our webinar, Podcasting Past, Present, and Future. You guys have a great weekend, and we'll see you again for the next program. Y'all have a good one.